Fakhani Quarter, Beirut, October 1973. A network commander at the key of a Fatah signal section keys the final transmission of his career, unaware that 1,100 kilometers to the south, a retired intercept operator has already logged 312 of his hand-sent Morse sessions and can pick his rhythm out of any burst on the shortwave band from memory. For 9 years, the commander never touches a key again, and the folder on the Galilee mountaintop is moved from active watch to the silent tray. Then, in February 1983, one emergency burst from an unlicensed transmitter in Athens crosses the same man's ear. Operation Cadence. Welcome to Operation Insights with Daniel, where the coldest instrument in an intelligence service is a patient man with a pair of headphones and a decade of memory. Subscribe now for more. Beirut, in 1969, wore 2 lives at once. On the Corniche Al Mazra, the palm trees still leaned over the traffic of Peugeot 404 and orange and black Mercedes service taxis, and the terrace of the Café de Paris on Hamra Street served coffee in small, heavy cups to businessmen from the American University a mile to the west. In the quarter called Fakhani, 3 streets south of the Corniche, a different Beirut was being built inside the walls of ordinary residential blocks. The Palestine Liberation Organization had regularized its armed activity in the Palestinian camps only weeks before, under the Cairo Agreement signed the previous November. Fatah, the largest of the PLO factions, had chosen the west of the city for its administrative and military center. On Fakhani Street, a building rose 4 stories above the traffic, unremarkable from the pavement, and inside on the second floor a small signal section had been set up with 2 Rockwell receivers and a hand-built HF transmitter fed by a wire aerial slung between 2 roof cisterns. The signal section was compartmented from the rest of Fatah in a way the outer offices were not. Its work was one way. It originated messages, and it never sat waiting for an answer. Its operators were chosen carefully. They came from the camps at Sabra and Burj el Barajneh, from families that had left Jaffa and Haifa in 1948 and never gone back, and each of them was cross-checked for family living inside Israel before he was placed in front of a key. In the summer of 1969, one of those checks came back clean on a young man from a camp near Sidon, whose name in the file was Muhi al-Din Rashwan. He was 30 years old, tall for the region, and he had been sending Morse in a civilian post office job in Sidon for 6 years, before a Fatah recruiter walked past his window one afternoon in April and recognized in the small movement of his wrist the thing every trained signals officer looks for. He was placed in front of a Vibroplex bug key in the second-floor room in Fakhani on the 11th of September, 1969. Within 2 months, he was the senior day shift operator. Within a year, he was the commander of a small network of couriers and secondary operators that ran between Beirut, Sidon, and the eastern reaches of the Bekaa Valley, moving papers and short traffic reports through cutouts to Fatah's political office in Amman, while Amman was still a working PLO capital. The Vibroplex he was given had been made in a factory in Knoxville, Tennessee, 3 years earlier, and had reached Fakhani via a family importer in Damascus who dealt in radio hobbyist supplies for the licensed amateur trade. It sat on his desk on a small rubber pad. The pendulum was chrome. The base was matte black. He had, by the end of that first month, adjusted the damper by a quarter of a turn so that his dots ran a fraction shorter than the factory setting, and he had not touched the adjustment again. The Fatah supervisor who watched him work had noted in a report to the section head that Rashwan sent with an economy that made the report sound like paperwork rather than radio, and had recommended that he be given the standing morning slot on the Eastern Courier net. He was given it. He kept it for 4 years. At the 11th hour of a particular Tuesday in November 1970, an operator 65 kilometers to the south, working the night shift at an intercept station on the summit of a Galilee mountain called Mount Meron, tuned across a band he had been assigned by a targeting order that morning and picked up an unfamiliar hand keying at 26 words per minute on a frequency his supervisor's log did not yet know. He wrote the frequency in his book, wrote the sending speed beside it, and added a short note in Hebrew that translated as New Fist, West Beirut Vector, Careful Sender, holds his spaces long. He gave the operator a tally number as protocol required. In the Meron system, that number was allotted sequentially inside the city vector. The number that came up next was 14. From that Tuesday onwards, the man in Fakhani, who would not know it for 4 years, and who would never know it in the way he was known, was Beirut 14. The intercept operator who wrote the entry in the log was 32 years old, born on Kibbutz Sasa in the Upper Galilee in 1938, to a family that had left Tripoli in Libya in 1948, with nothing but the clothes they were wearing, and the mother tongue that would eventually put him in front of a receiver at HF Morse. His name was Gavriel Ben Arroya. Everyone at the station called him Gavri. He had joined Unit 8200 in 1961, out of a compulsory service that had put him first into an infantry battalion, and then, on the basis of a single conversation with an officer who had heard him hold his own in Judeo-Arabic and standard Palestinian dialect in the same afternoon, into the signals interception school at Glilot Junction, north of Tel Aviv. He had learned Morse on a standard J38 straight key as a 14-year-old on the Kibbutz Radio Club. By the time he was posted to the summit at Meron in 1969, he could take hand-sent code at 40 words per minute without pencil in one hand and cup of tea in the other. He could also do the thing the Allies had been teaching signals analysts to do since the middle 1940s. He could identify individual operators by the way they held their spaces, by the ratio between the length of their dots and the length of their dashes, by the tiny catch a right-handed sender makes when he transitions from a letter with 2 dashes to a letter with 3 dots. The Allied technique had a name from World War II. It was called TINA, Telegraph Instrument Numerical Analysis. In 1942, the British had been running paper tape at 16 feet per minute through undulators to record German operators sending on U-boat traffic, and had used the ratios measured on graph paper by young women of the Women's Royal Naval Service to fingerprint individual sending hands across ship transfers and call sign rotations. In the Meron watch of 1970, the paper tape was gone, but the discipline remained. Reels of quarter-inch tape on Nagra 4S recorders, 1 reel per shift, labeled by supervisor initial and calendar date, and stored in a metal cabinet in a room off the operations floor. A fist forms inside a listener's memory in a way that resists description. It is not one thing. It is the small hesitation before a proper noun, the tightening of the timing when the operator is nervous, the way the sending speeds up almost imperceptibly across the last 2 lines of a long message, because the operator wants to be finished. It is the shape of the sender's whole day pressed onto the wire in a way he does not know he is pressing it. Ben Arroya had a photographic memory for it. 6 months into the Beirut 14 file, he could tell the supervisor within 4 keystrokes whether the operator on the frequency was the same man he had heard on the Sunday previous. By the end of 1971, when Beirut 14 had gone up to more than 100 logged sessions on the file, he could tell without looking at the log which of the Fatah signal section's 4 regular operators was on the key by the ratio of dot to dash alone. By September 1973, his internal file on Beirut 14 ran to 312 individually recorded sessions. He had heard the man send in the small hours of the morning, in the middle of a September thunderstorm that made the ground wave arrive dirty, in the fumbling first minutes after an operator has drunk 2 glasses of Iraq. He had never seen the man's face and never expected to. He knew him the way one blind musician knows another he has only ever heard on tape. The Yom Kippur War began at 2 in the afternoon, local time on the 6th of October, 1973, a Saturday. Egyptian units crossed the Suez Canal, Syrian units drove into the Golan, and inside 24 hours, the intercept watch on Meron had trebled its staffing. Every operator on the roster was tuned to the Levantine bands. Ben Arroya was on the second trick of the second day, 2200 hours local, when the tape on Beirut 14's assigned frequency ran across a session that started at 4 groups per minute and ended 18 minutes later at 0. The last group Rashwan sent was an unusual signature the section had not used before. 4 letters that could not be found in any Fatah codebook the desk had catalogued. Then the carrier collapsed and the frequency went to noise. Benaroya recognized, as any operator of his experience would have recognized, that the signature was a farewell. It was not a farewell that expected a return message. It was closer to the kind of thing a man writes at the bottom of a page he does not intend to write again. Because he was on the second trick that night and had another 3 hours of watch to run, he stayed on the frequency. Because Beirut 14 did not come back, he moved after his shift to the day supervisor's office and wrote the note that the day supervisor placed at the top of the file the following morning. The note in Benaroya's own handwriting read, "Ended on a signature previously unlogged. Presume operator withdrawn. Recommend hold this frequency 30 days." Beirut 14 did not return to the air in the 12 remaining days of the war. He did not return in the 90 days that followed. Benaroya kept an unofficial hold on the frequency across 3 of his own watches per week for 11 weeks. In late December of 1973, a targeting officer arrived from Glilot Junction and asked Benaroya, professionally and without ceremony, whether it was worth continuing to hold the frequency. The answer was no. The Beirut 14 file, 312 labeled reels of quarter-inch tape in the cabinet off the operations floor, was carried by hand across the corridor and placed on the shelf marked in Hebrew that translated as, "Silent, do not close." The frequency was held. It did not light. In the last week of January 1974, another intercept operator on Benaroya's rotation, a corporal who had been on the Beirut vector for 6 months, asked in the officers' mess whether Benaroya thought Beirut 14 was dead. Benaroya said no. He said that operators who die on the job die on the frequency, mid-sentence. He said that operators who die out of uniform, killed in raids or in ambushes or in car crashes on the coast road, leave a silence that opens on a normal transmission. He said that Beirut 14 had ended on a signature he had put together himself, and that a man who signs a signature of his own choosing has been given time to think. He said that Beirut 14 had been pulled off the key by someone above him, and that he was still alive, and that on some day in the next 10 years he might come back on the air, and that when he did, the tape in the cabinet would be the reason they knew who he was. 2 years later, in the autumn of 1975, Benaroya reached his mandatory age for uniformed reservist service and retired to Kibbutz Sasa, 108 kilometers north of Tel Aviv. He took over his father's small orchard on the north-facing slope, worked the trees through the dry summers, taught Morse to the kibbutz youth club on a straight key on Wednesday evenings, and drank coffee at the kibbutz dining hall with 2 other retired sergeants major, whose service he was cleared to discuss and no one else's. The Beirut 14 tapes did not follow him to the kibbutz. Nothing did. When he handed his badge in on his last morning at Meron, he handed in also the notebook he had used from the day the fist was first logged. It was filed at Glilot. He was told he might one day be recalled to consult on it. He said, without irony, that he thought that was unlikely. In November of 1975, a young analyst called Lior Sagi joined research division at Glilot Junction on his first posting and inherited a wall of gray metal cabinets in a windowless room off Corridor B. One of them carried on its side a printed label reading Beirut Vector, Silent Operators, and inside its second drawer was a small green card bearing the number 14. Between the closing of the silent tray and the burst that opened it again ran 9 years of Middle Eastern history that has been better told elsewhere and cannot be summarized in a chapter. What matters for the Beirut 14 file is a much smaller list. Ali Hassan Salameh, Chief of Operations for Black September and founder of Force 17, was killed on the 22nd of January 1979 on Rue Verdun in West Beirut at 15:35 in the afternoon by 100 kilograms of explosive attached to a car on the curb as his own convoy passed. Salameh had lived openly in Fakhani for the better part of a decade before the Mossad found the routine that pinned him. The block on Rue Verdun where he died lay a walking mile and a half from the second-floor room in Fakhani, where Beirut 14 had once kept the wire aerial slung between two roof cisterns. 3 years later, on the 30th of August, 1982, under the protection of a multinational force that had landed in the port of Beirut, Yasser Arafat and approximately 8,500 fighters of the Palestine Liberation Organization were evacuated from West Beirut and dispersed to a scattering of Arab capitals. The largest single tranche was moved to Tunis on the coast of Tunisia, where the PLO opened a new administrative headquarters in the seaside town of Hammam Chot, 20 kilometers south of the capital on the Gulf of Tunis. Others went to Baghdad, to Aden, to Algiers, to Khartoum. A small number of political and technical staff, unaccounted for in the public tallies, went by ferry from Larnaca to Piraeus and were quietly absorbed by the Fatah support cell in the Greek capital, where the Papandreou government had granted the PLO diplomatic recognition the previous October, and where an open office had been operating on Vassilissis Sophia's Avenue since the winter. The silent tray file at Glilot Junction, meanwhile, did what silent tray files do. It was consulted twice a year by a rotating research desk that ran the standard check of every silent operator against the traffic of the previous 6 months. The check involved pulling a reference reel at random from the file, running it against a computer-assisted comparator that had been installed at Glilot in 1978, and cross-checking the ratio profile of the reference against any hand-sent Morse the Levantine desk had captured in the intervening period, whose sender remained unidentified. In 7.5 years, the check on Beirut 14 came back clean each time. It was consulted also, on 3 occasions across the same period, by an officer from Caesarea, who was following a lead on a Fatah support cell address in a European city, and wanted to know whether the desk held reference material on any signals operator, whose known geography included that city. In each case, the desk's answer was no. Beirut 14's known geography was Fakhani, Sidon, and the Bekaa. The desk had never placed him anywhere outside Lebanon. In January of 1983, the young analyst who had inherited it in 1975, no longer young, ran the January check and closed the file for another 6 months. She noted on the card a routine entry in the small handwriting she had developed for the cards themselves. 14. No return. Standard cycle. Below it, she signed her initials, LS, and the date, the 11th of January. 25 days later, the burst came. The 5th of February, 1983, was a Saturday. In Athens, it had rained until after midnight, and the rain had cleared. The streets of Kolonaki were empty by 2 in the morning. Only a single yellow Mercedes 200D taxi rolled slowly down Skoufa, looking for a fare. 1,150 kilometers to the east, at the summit of Har Meron in the Upper Galilee, elevation 1,204 meters above sea level, coordinates 32 degrees 59 minutes, 52 seconds north, 35 degrees 24 minutes 49 seconds east. The night trick of the intercept watch was on duty in the operations room. The Rakal RA-17 receivers glowed in their racks. The frequencies of interest across the Levant band were preset on 12 of them. The 13th was a wideband receiver used for troll searches on any unlicensed carrier that came up outside the assigned targets. At 0118 hours Coordinated Universal Time, that is to say 3:18 local at Meron, and the same at Athens, the wideband receiver picked up a carrier on 8,145 kilohertz. The operator on watch, a corporal on his 2nd month at the station, listened to it for 4 seconds and hit the tape start toggle without checking the log. The signal was hand-sent Morse. The sending speed was 26 words per minute. It ran for 2 minutes and 47 seconds. It sent 1 call block, 5 groups of 5 characters, and then closed off with a signature the corporal did not recognize. When he checked with his supervisor after the transmission had ended, the supervisor pulled a card from the daybook and confirmed that 8,145 was not an assigned Levant band target frequency for that quarter. The tape was pulled off the machine, labeled with the date and the UTC time, and placed in the incoming basket for the morning shift. At the top of the tape reel, the corporal had written in Hebrew a 2-word supervisor note. It translated as hand sender, unusual. He did not add the word he was thinking, because he was too junior to volunteer a fist opinion on a first hearing. The word he was thinking was careful. The supervisor on the day shift the following morning, however, would add a further word to the note. He was a warrant officer with 16 years on the desk who had held the Beirut vector in 1972 when Ben Arroyo had been on the same watches. He had heard Beirut 14 more times than any operator at the station, other than Ben Arroyo himself. When he pulled the reel off the machine at 0645 and put it on his own headphones, he sat in the corner of the operations room for 11 minutes without moving. When he stood up, he added, under the corporal's note, 4 Hebrew letters in his own hand that translated as the standard priority elevation flag of the desk. He then walked across the corridor to the operations telephone and made a call, and the tape was in a locked satchel in an army jeep going down the Meron road 40 minutes later. 1,200 kilometers southwest of Meron, on the coast of Cyprus at Ayios Nikolaos station near Dekalia, the British Composite Signals Organization Night Watch was also on duty. Ayios Nikolaos had been running as an intercept station under British authority since 1947 and had watched every Middle Eastern crisis since Suez. Its supervisor on the night of the 5th of February 1983 was a signals officer whose name in the station's log was Nigel Craddock. The wideband receiver at Ayios Nikolaos also caught the burst on 8,145 kilohertz. The Adcock antenna array behind the operations block gave an initial azimuth of 289 degrees off station, plus or minus 3, which is to say the general bearing of the Aegean. The Ayios Nikolaos supervisor logged the burst under the station's own numbering, filed the tape, and following the informal courtesy that had operated between his watch and the Israeli watch at Meron for approximately 15 years, sent a single teleprinter line at 0632 hours UTC to a duty officer at Glilot Junction that read, "Unlicensed HF Morse, 8145, our azimuth 289 at 0118, if of interest." At the moment the teleprinter carried that line, the 2 3/4 minute reel on the incoming basket at Meron had not yet been touched. The reel was pulled from the basket by the day shift supervisor at 0645 hours local, 4 minutes after the Ayios Nikolaos line had arrived at Glilot Junction. The supervisor was a warrant officer with 16 years on the desk. He listened to the reel twice, made a phone call to Glilot, and drove down the mountain in an army jeep to the operations center at Rosh Pina to send a scrambled message that ended up on the desk of the officer commanding Unit 8200's Levantine Signals Branch by lunchtime. The message asked for a listening panel to be convened at Glilot Junction within 72 hours. It asked for the recall of every retired operator who had held the Fatah Fakhani vector desk between 1968 and 1974. It named 3 of them. The first name on the list was Ben Arroyo. The letter arrived at Kibbutz Sasa by the Wednesday Morning Post. It was from the officer commanding, and it opened with the standard formula for the recall of a reservist to a technical consultation. Ben Arroyo, 45 years old that spring, was told to present himself at Glilot Junction the following Monday at 0800 hours for a consultation of not less than 1 day and not more than 3. The letter did not name the operator whose tape he was being brought in to hear. It did not need to. He drove down from the Galilee in his own Peugeot 204 on the Sunday afternoon and stayed the night with a cousin in Herzliya. On the Monday morning, the 9th of February 1983, he presented himself at the reception hut at the north gate of Glilot Junction at 7:52, was signed in by a corporal who did not know him, was given a visitor's badge coded to Research Division, and was walked across the compound to a low gray building with no windows on its east face and a single steel door on its west. Inside on the ground floor was a room he had not entered in 7.5 years. It held a Rakal RA-17 receiver in a rack against one wall, a Nagra 4S recorder on a desk, 2 swivel chairs, a set of AKG K140 headphones on a hook, and a small green baize card table under an overhead light. 2 other men were there when he arrived. The first was Meshulam, a captain from the Meron direction-finding cell, whom he had not previously met. The second was the officer commanding Levantine Signals Branch, whom he had. On the table lay a single, unlabeled Nagra reel. The commanding officer indicated the chair by the receiver. Ben Arroyo sat, put the headphones on, and listened. The tape ran 2 minutes and 47 seconds. He did not speak until it had ended. He asked the officer commanding to run it a second time. When it had ended the second time, he removed the headphones, put them back on the hook, and said in a voice that was flatter than his usual voice, "Beirut 14. The officer commanding asked him to explain. Ben Arroyo said the operator on the tape was sending on a bug key, not on the model he had used in 1972. The old key had been a Vibroplex original with a chrome pendulum and a slightly slack damper. The new one, from the timing of the dashes, was probably a Vibroplex iambic standard with a stiffer damper and a shorter dot period, and it had been factory tuned rather than adjusted by the operator. He said the operator had aged. He said the operator was frightened. He said the operator was sending from a room in which somebody else was awake and would hear him send if he were sloppy. He said in the flat voice that the operator held the space between the third and the fourth dot of every set of 5 in the same tight, minutely shortened way, and that the space between the third and the fourth dot was the way you recognized Beirut 14. He said he had heard 312 sessions of the man and had held the file for 4 years and could identify him without hesitation. The officer commanding wrote nothing down. Meshulam took a small photograph of the tape reel with a Practica LLC on the table and left the room. That afternoon, a car took Ben Arroyo from the low gray building on the west of the Glilot compound to a taller building on the east that housed Research Division. He was escorted to a second-floor office whose door bore a stenciled letter and a 2-digit number and nothing else. Inside, at a metal desk under an overhead light, was Lior Sagi. She was 33 years old that February, born in Rehovot in 1949, and she had inherited the Beirut Vector's silent operators from a predecessor in November of 1975. She had opened a card marked 14 on her second morning of work, and had never let a January or a July pass without pulling it. She stood up when Ben Arroyo was shown in. They had never met. She did not tell him that the fist on the tape had already been provisionally matched to Beirut 14 the previous week by another means. She had run the tape through a comparator against the standard set of reference reels held in the archive room across the corridor, 10 seconds at a time, and had matched it on ratio of dot to dash to a 97% confidence inside 40 minutes of work. She had done it on her own initiative before the listening panel had been convened, because she had had the file for 7 years and had waited for the burst. She did tell him that the tally card carried 312 labeled sessions from the years he had held the desk, and that the tapes had been kept in their original boxes in the second drawer of the cabinet on the far wall. She opened the drawer and showed him the boxes. He recognized the initial he had written on the flaps of the reels in 1972. He said, again in the flat voice, that he supposed it would be useful for him to take one of the reference reels next door and cross-check her comparator work under headphones. She had already put a reel on the second Nagra in the smaller room adjoining hers. They worked for 4 hours, without lunch, taking sections of the February tape and playing them against 10-second segments of 5 separate 1972 sessions from the reference reels. Sagi kept the confidence log. Ben Arroyo sat with the headphones on and did not look at the log. At the end of the 4th hour, she asked him to give a final opinion. He said, "It is the same hand. He is 9 years older, and he is nervous, and he is on a bug key that is not the one he used in 72, but it is the same hand." The file on Beirut 14 was moved that evening from the silent shelf to the operations shelf. The operation was named that night, in a small conference room down the corridor, by the officer commanding Research Division herself, Nama El-Grabli, who had been reading the tally card for the whole afternoon. She named the operation for the property of an operator's hand that no service in the world had ever taught a man to defeat. She called it Operation Cadence. Sagi telephoned Benaroya at his cousin's apartment in Herzliya that evening at 10:50. She asked him a single question. She asked him whether, in his professional opinion, if the operator on the tape were given a warning by his controllers and moved to a new frequency, and to a new key, and to a new city, and were then to send again in 6 months' time, he would still be able to be recognized. Benaroya was silent for a long moment. Then he said, in the same flat voice, that the operator could be moved to any city in the world and given any key in the world and put on any frequency in the world, and that if he sent a message longer than 60 seconds by hand on a semi-automatic key, the tape at Glilot would identify him. He said that the operator could stop sending altogether. He said that was the only way to avoid identification. He said he did not think the operator would stop. He said the operator had come back on the air after 9 years because he had wanted to. He said that a man who has wanted for 9 years to send a message he could not send would send another before the winter was out. The operation was briefed the following Saturday, the 12th of February 1983, at a Mossad facility in Herzliya inland from the beach. The room was small and windowless. 9 people were present. 4 of them ran the operation. 4 of them ran the divisions that would support it, and the 9th was the deputy chief of Caesarea, who took no notes and asked 3 questions across 2 hours. The 4 who ran it were Nahmias, a lieutenant colonel with case officer service in the Vienna station between 1976 and 1980. Alfasi, a 30-year-old combatant who spoke Arabic, French and German with the accents her legends required. Kimhi, a technical officer whose specialism was portable HF direction finding under civilian cover, and Halevi, a surveillance officer who would run the static watch on the target's address once it had been fixed. The plan they built was thin and required a set of things to happen in an order none of them controlled. The tape had come to them because the man had made a mistake. The mistake was a single burst on an unlicensed frequency, on a night when a corporal at Meron had happened to hit the tape start toggle within 4 seconds of the first character. There was no reason to believe he would make the mistake again, and every reason to believe that whichever cell was running him would tell him to break the aerial and move his key. The team's operational premise was therefore that the address they were hunting was a Fatah support cell safe apartment in a European city, that if the man was on a key at all, he was on a key inside that city, and that the 2 remaining bearings they had, the Meron azimuth of 278 degrees and the Ayios Nikolaos azimuth of 289 degrees, cut the shortwave ionosphere at the second hop somewhere over the northern Aegean, and pulled a target ellipse that fell across roughly 150 square kilometers of the Attic Peninsula. The peninsula meant Athens. Alfasi's legend was set at the briefing. She was to fly in on the 14th of February on a Lufthansa flight from Frankfurt via Zurich, on the West German passport of a real freelance journalist named Katrin Reuter, whose accreditation as an occasional stringer for a Zurich-based Middle East Affairs Monthly had been established over the previous 11 months by a support cell operating out of the Zurich station. She was to take a room at a small hotel on Lukianow Street in the Kolonaki quarter, near the Parliament and near the pavement cafes, where a working freelance journalist of her class would live. She was to move on foot in the neighborhood and to use the yellow Athenian Mercedes 200D taxis whose flagfall was 25 drachmas, and she was to keep her rented Peugeot for the crosstown canvas only. Kimmy was to travel separately, arriving on the 15th from Rome on an Alitalia ticket, on a Belgian passport in the name of a real Antwerp-registered antique radio dealer, whose civilian file would stand up to a walk-in at any police station in Europe. The scion was named for the first time at the briefing that Saturday. He was Dimitris Papazoglou, a 58-year-old Greek Jew whose grandparents had left Thessaloniki for Athens in 1913, and whose small electronics repair shop on Themistokleous Street in Exarchaea had been on the Athens station's list of Sayanim since 1969. He was a serious man. He had been asked once before, in 1978, whether he would allow the back room of the shop to be used for the temporary installation of a piece of equipment. He had asked no questions on that occasion, and would ask none now. Alfasi landed at Athens Elinikon East Terminal on the 14th of February 1983 at 11:53 in the morning, local time. She traveled with one suitcase and a soft leather portfolio and cleared passport control on the West German document without incident. She took a yellow taxi from the arrivals ramp into the center and paid the driver in dollars, which he accepted at a favorable rate against the drachma. The drachma had been devalued in early January and was standing at approximately 74 to the American dollar. On the drive-in along Poseidonos Avenue, she noted the two rented Cortina taxis and one blue Fiat 131 that pulled out from the ranks in front of them and confirmed inside 2 minutes that neither was following. The driver spoke reasonable English and told her, unprompted, that a north wind called the Vorios had come down that morning from the Balkans and would keep the air cold and clear all day. She took her room at the small Kolonaki Hotel at 1500 hours. The window looked west across the flat roofs of the block towards Likavitos, whose small white chapel of St. George at the summit was clearly visible in the clear February light. She hung the coat on the hook, checked the bathroom, checked the room. She walked once around the square on foot, bought a copy of the Athens News in English and a copy of Tuvima in Greek from a period kiosk on the north side of the square, drank a small cup of coffee at a corner cafe whose name she did not need to remember, and returned to her room. She sat for 20 minutes at the writing table and composed by hand, on the freelance journalist's letterhead she had brought from Zurich, the outline of an article on the Greek shipping industry's response to the January devaluation. She would file the article, in due course, to the Zurich Monthly, and it would run in a shortened form in the April number under the signature Katrin Reuter. At 16:30, she made a call from a public telephone box on the corner of Luciano and Plutarcho, using a phone card she had bought at a kiosk 20 minutes earlier. She spoke for 90 seconds in French to a number in Bern that would ring on to a number in Herzliya, and she used the covering phrase for a first arrival that had been agreed at the Herzliya briefing 4 days earlier. The Bern number acknowledged and rang off. She replaced the receiver and stood for a moment on the pavement, watching a woman in a wine-red coat push a pram along the opposite side of Kolonaki Square. The woman crossed at the corner and disappeared into the arcade below Filion. Alfasi went into the cafe next door to the telephone box, ordered a small espresso and drank it standing at the counter, watching the street through the plate glass window for 14 minutes. Nothing came past that was not ordinary. She returned to her hotel by a different route. At 10 in the evening, she left the hotel and walked southeast across Syntagma Square, past the Parliament and the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, where the Evzones changed guard on the hour, and continued for 11 minutes on foot into the neighborhood of Pangradi. She entered a small taverna on Eftidu Street she had never seen before and would never return to, ordered dolmades and a small carafe of retsina, and left 43 minutes later. When she walked back to Kolonaki along Vasilisas Sophias Avenue, she noted the lit window on the 4th floor of the PLO office at number 216, where a slim figure stood at a whiteboard with his back to the street. She did not slow. She reached the hotel at 9:52 and slept until 6 the next morning. Kimi arrived from Rome at Elinikon on the afternoon of the 15th of February. He carried a suitcase, a metal briefcase of the kind the Belgian antique radio trade used to transport valuable valves, and a passport in the name Louis Van Steenkiste that had been in use for 2 operations in the previous 18 months. The briefcase contained, in its lower compartment, a Rohde & Schwarz PF555 portable HF direction finder in 3 sections, a spool of insulated antenna wire, and a small oscilloscope no larger than a paperback book. In its upper compartment, on top of the equipment, lay 4 Bakelite valves of the pre-war period and a repair invoice in Flemish. If the case was opened at customs, the valves would be found first. He took a hotel in Plaka, close under the Acropolis, and after dark that evening walked north through the streets of the old city, through the small square at Kolokotroni, up Panepistimiou, past the old university, and across into the sloping streets of Exarchia. The quarter carried its usual Tuesday evening life. There were posters glued to the walls advertising a concert at the Rex the following weekend, and a demonstration outside the American Embassy at Christmas the year before. He walked past the shop on Themistocleus Street twice, on opposite sides of the street, and confirmed that it was open, that Papazoglou was behind the counter working on a Grundig transistor, with a soldering iron in one hand and a magnifying glass in the other, and that no man had been sitting in a parked car within sight of the door for more than 20 minutes. He entered the shop at 1940 hours and put a Belgian tourist's smile on his face and asked, in French, whether the proprietor could do anything with a 1953 EL-84 valve whose grid had gone. Papazoglou, who spoke French, examined the valve for a long minute and said in French that he could not, but that he had another he could exchange for it. Kimi accepted. He then said in Ladino that he had brought a message from a friend in Salonika. Papazoglou put the soldering iron down and turned the sign in the window to indicate that the shop was closed. They spoke for 8 minutes in the back room. Papazoglou did not ask what the equipment would do or who the target was. He asked only 3 practical questions. He asked whether the aerial would need to run above the roofline, which would attract the attention of the maintenance man from the block, whether the equipment would draw more than the workshop's normal current, which would be visible on the electricity meter downstairs, and whether the operation required him to close the shop for any period longer than one afternoon, which his customers would notice. Kimi answered no to the first, no to the second, and no to the third. Papazoglou nodded once and pushed a stack of Grundig transistor housings to one side of the workbench to make room. By 0100 hours that night, the direction finder was assembled in the back room behind a bead curtain, plugged into a mains adapter under a workbench, and the Rode and Schwartz oscilloscope was sitting under a piece of felt on top of a 1960 valve amplifier that Papazoglou had brought out from the cellar to disguise the fresh wire. A wire aerial ran up the inside of the wall behind the workbench, through a hole in the plaster no larger than a pencil, into the attic above the shop, and out along the underside of the tile roof for a distance of 23 meters, terminating in a folded-back tip that Papazoglou himself had insulated with black tape. Kimi tuned to 8,145 kilohertz. The receiver in the back room hissed with the standard mid-band noise. No carrier. He set the automatic gain, adjusted the direction finder for a null on the ambient noise, closed the felt over the oscilloscope, and left the shop by the rear door at 0212 hours. The cross-bearing with Ayios Nikolaos was not a joint operation. It was the small institutional courtesy that had operated between the British night supervisor and the Israeli night supervisor for approximately 15 years, transacted by teleprinter and never minuted at either end. On the 16th of February, the courtesy was called on twice. The first call went south from Meron at 0610 hours UTC in the morning. It asked whether the Ayios Nikolaos wideband desk could hold on 8,145 kilohertz for the coming 48 hours during the propagation window between 0100 and 0400 coordinated universal time, and, if the frequency lit up with a hand-sent Morse burst in that window, log the azimuth to plus or minus 1 degree. Ayios Nikolaos returned a 2-line acknowledgement inside the hour. It would. The second call was the arithmetic call. Meron's own Adcock array had given the 5th of February burst a bearing of 278 degrees off station, plus or minus 2. Ayios Nikolaos had given 289. The baseline between the two stations, measured across the Mediterranean between Har Meron and the summit of the hill behind the Ayios Nikolaos operations block, was 348 kilometers. The angle of intersection at the crossing point, once both bearings were extended, was 57 degrees. That is a favorable geometry for HF direction finding at range. The two bearings cut at an ellipse whose long axis lay approximately north, northeast, and south-southwest, and whose short axis was cross-cut by the shorter angle. The center of the ellipse fell over the Attic Peninsula at latitude 38 degrees north, longitude 23 degrees 50 minutes east, plus or minus 5 kilometers. When the direction-finding cell at Meron overlaid the ellipse onto a 1979 street map of Athens they had ordered from the Israeli embassy in Bern 6 years earlier, the ellipse covered the quarters of Exarchia, Kolonaki, Neapoli, and the western fringes of Pangrati, approximately 5 kilometers by 2, 150 square kilometers reduced to 10. The direction-finding officer at Meron, whose codename in the operation was Azimuth, telephoned Herzliya at 11:15 local time on the 16th to give Namias the ellipse. Namias, whose codename in the operation was Tuning, was on his way at that moment to a briefing with Alfasi at a coffee house on Kifisias Avenue in Athens that had been chosen because it had 2 exits and a mezzanine. He carried the ellipse with him folded inside a copy of the Herald Tribune. He did not open the paper until after Alfasi had ordered. The other property of the ellipse he did not open the paper to explain in the coffee house was that its geometry was going to decay over the coming 48 hours. Ionospheric propagation in the mid-band shifts under seasonal and diurnal cycles, and a bearing pair taken on a February night at 3 in the morning is a bearing pair for February nights at 3 in the morning. A second transmission at a different local hour would give a fresh set of bearings, and if the difference was more than 2 or 3 degrees, the ellipse would shift by kilometers. That did not matter to a team that had already reduced the ellipse to 10 square kilometers. It mattered a great deal to a team that had not yet found the building. Meshulam's expectation at Meron, which he had passed to Nahmias through the officer commanding on the 15th, was that the ellipse he had produced from the 5th of February burst was probably good until the 20th of the month, after which the propagation window would begin to shift as the season did, and any second transmission from the same operator on the same frequency would give bearings that overlapped the first pair only at their western edge. In practice, the propagation held to expectation across the 17th and 18th. The team had the days it needed. Kimi took delivery of the rented Peugeot 504 Estate from Attica Executive Cars in Kolonaki at 11:20 on the morning of the 17th of February. Elpida Venturi, who managed the small firm and who had been on the Athens station's list since 1971, put the paperwork through in a Swiss name that had cover in Zurich. Kimhi loaded the direction finder into the underfloor spare wheel well of the Peugeot estate, ran the aerial wire up under the vinyl roof lining and out through the rubber grommet at the rear of the roof gutter, and set the oscilloscope in the passenger footwell under a folded picnic blanket. From the driver's seat, adjusting the gain with his right knee holding the wheel, he could take a bearing without moving his hands off the door. He drove north on Vasilissis Sophias in the morning traffic, turned into the streets of Neapoli, and began the canvass. The Peugeot 504's 2-liter petrol engine produced approximately 71 kilowatts and would move the saloon to 186 kilometers an hour on an open road, though the estate variant Kimhi drove that morning would never see much above 90 on the choked streets of central Athens. On the streets of Neapoli, it did 15. He drove in a slow declining spiral inward towards the center of the ellipse, holding at each intersection for the time it took him to take a bearing on any spurious carrier that appeared on the direction finder. Most of the carriers were the local number stations and the 2 Bulgarian broadcasters that trafficked the 8,000 kilohertz band routinely at that hour, and each of those he cleared inside 4 minutes. At 11:47 hours, he crossed Solonos Street and came into Exarchia proper. At 12:22 hours, he passed Papazoglu's shop, looked once at the awning without slowing, and continued. At 13:10 hours, at a stoplight on Emanuel Benaki Street, between Solonos and Dido II, a spurious carrier lit up his direction finder for the length of time it took him to take the pattern on the oscilloscope. The carrier was not on 8,145, it was on 7,900, a frequency neither of Bulgaria's transmitters used, and it carried a Morse identity sequence at speed. The identity sequence was standard 4-group amateur band. The operator was almost certainly a licensed enthusiast, holding a Greek call sign that would appear in the ITU list. But the pattern on the oscilloscope was a hard, tight ellipse whose axis was pointed exactly along the street he had stopped on. He wrote the moment in his cover notebook as a lunch stop. He returned to the same intersection at 1736 and again at 2204. The pattern on the oscilloscope closed a little each time. By midnight, he had a rectangle 2 blocks wide and 1 block long inside which the transmitter was living, and by 2 in the morning he had a building. He met Nahmias at 0330 hours in a taverna on Lika Vitos that stayed open until dawn. He told Nahmias the number of the building on Emanuel Benaki. He told him the floor by process of elimination. The aerial ran up the outside of the light well on the west side of the building, and only the 4th floor had a light on when the 3rd carrier went up. Nahmias walked out of the taverna at 0345 and walked to a public telephone at the corner of Kolonaki Square and made a call to a number in Herzliya from a piece of paper he then tore in half. Kimhi drove the Peugeot back to the Attica Executive Cars lot at 4 in the morning, parked it, walked 7 blocks north to his hotel, and slept for 4 hours. He was back at Papazoglu's shop at 9 in the morning to check the equipment in the back room. The direction finder had held its calibration overnight. The oscilloscope's phosphor showed no fresh trace on the frequency. Papazoglu brought him a cup of Greek coffee with 2 spoons of sugar and said, without looking at him, that a man in a beige raincoat had walked past the shop 3 times between 8 and 9 that morning, which was unusual for the street on a Thursday, and that he had noted the raincoat because the man had been carrying a copy of the previous day's Athens news, which no Athenian would carry a day late. Kimhi thanked him, drank the coffee, walked to the front of the shop, and looked once through the glass. The beige raincoat was not visible on Themistoclea Street at that moment. He walked out of the shop by the front door, took a taxi to a cafe in Neapoli that he had never entered before, and used its telephone to make a call to Nahmias at his hotel. At 0247 hours Coordinated Universal Time on the 18th of February, that is to say 0447 local Athens time, in the coldest part of a February night, the frequency 8,145 kHz lit up for the second time in 13 days. The Ayios Nikolaos night supervisor, who had been holding as the courtesy required, logged an azimuth of 289 degrees again, at plus or minus 2/3 of a degree. The Meron night watch logged 278, at plus or minus 1. The crosscut, run inside the operations building at Meron in fewer than 9 minutes, produced an ellipse whose center fell within 200 meters of the intersection of Emanuel Benaki and Dido II. The transmission itself ran for 56 seconds. It carried a single message of 8 cipher groups. It closed with the same 4-letter signature the Beirut 14 file had first recorded on the 6th of October, 1973, and had not seen since. It was received at Meron at a signal strength of 5/9 on the operator's meter, clear enough that a trained ear could hear the individual clicks of the bug's damper against its stop. The tape was pulled off the machine at Meron and put on a courier flight from Rosh Pina to Stadov Airfield in Tel Aviv that landed at 0620 hours local. By 9 in the morning, the tape was in the room off the operations floor at Glilot. By 10, Benaroya had heard it under headphones with Sagi at the desk. He said, when the tape had ended, without looking up, "Same hand, same operator, same bug. He is on the 4th floor." He said the last sentence because when the tape had rewound to the 22nd second, the ambient noise behind the sender had picked up the muted rumble of a diesel truck passing on a street below, and the delay between the visual carrier onset on the direction finder's oscilloscope and the audible arrival of the truck's low harmonic on the tape corresponded to a height above street level of approximately 14 meters. Benaroya said this without theater, as an old operator states a piece of arithmetic he has done many times in the war years, and Sagi wrote the figure on the tally card and put a small mark next to it. Benaroya had one further thing to say. He said that the operator's rhythm on the second transmission was different in one measurable respect from the rhythm on the first. On the first, he had opened at his normal speed and had held it. On the second, he had opened at his normal speed and had accelerated across the 8 groups by approximately 1 word per minute. He was in more of a hurry on the second. Somebody had told him, in the intervening 13 days, that he had probably been heard. He was closing his own channel. He was not being closed by his controllers. Benaroya said this because he wanted the operational side to understand that the window was going to close from the operator's end and not from the controller's end, and that the closing might happen at any moment inside the coming week. At the moment he wrote the figure, Alfasi in Athens was drinking Nescafe Frappé in the mezzanine of the Kifisias coffee house and receiving from Namias, across the small round table with the paper covered in numbers between them, the address on Emanuel Benaki, 4th floor, west side. She wrote nothing on the paper. She looked up at the beamed ceiling. She said in German, which they were speaking, that the Vorios wind had turned overnight and there would be cloud by afternoon. For 6 nights and 6 days after the second transmission, the operation did what a Caesarea operation of the period did, which was to establish presence without contact. Halevi took the safe house watch. The safe house was a 2-room apartment, leased through a Papazoglu cousin on the 5th floor of a building at the top of Emanuel Benaki, 1 street north of the 4th floor room on the target building. Its west-facing kitchen window looked directly into the target room across the light well. The angle was steep enough that at night, with the target room's curtains part open by even an inch, Halevi could see the top of a table under a green-shaded desk lamp on which sat a Vibroplex bug key of the standard model, right-handed chrome pendulum, the base painted matte black, and a bakelite headset trailing its cord out of shot. She saw the operator once in the 6 days, at 08:15 hours on the 21st of February. She saw only the top of a head, gray hair thinning at the crown, cut short at the neck, as he crossed the light well window carrying a small enamel coffee pot from the direction of the kitchen. He did not look towards her window. He set the pot on the table and passed out of the frame. She wrote the time and the description on a plain white card, which was couriered that afternoon to Namias at his hotel by a Papazoglu nephew on a Vespa. On the night of the 24th of February, Namias moved 4 of his people into positions the direction finder had not shown him, and the safe house watch had. Kimhi took the Peugeot to a parking place 3 blocks south. Alfasi took a room on the 2nd floor of the same target building under the Katrin Reuter passport, having booked it by telephone that afternoon on the pretext of a research trip to the Kolonaki library. Halevi remained at her kitchen window. A 4th combatant of the team, a man named Segal, took position at the head of the staircase inside the target building, on a small brown wooden bench, which the concierge had put there for the use of tenants who did not wish to wait for the lift. At 03:20 hours local Athens time on the 25th of February, the 4th floor light came on. Halevi watched the operator sit down at the table. She watched him remove the felt cover from the receiver on the shelf above the desk, tune it slowly across the midband, and press the tape start on a small Uher 4400 report recorder to his left. She watched him place his right hand on the Vibroplex bug key. She watched him send the standard opening handshake of the Fatah signal section of 1972. She watched him send 9 groups of 5 characters and hold at the 10th. She watched him close. She wrote the time, 03:27 and 41 seconds local. She wrote the words, last message. She watched him then do the thing that a professional radio operator does at the close of a working session that will not be repeated. He did not stand up immediately. He held his hand on the key for a further 8 seconds, exactly the length of time a small operator's clock takes to complete 2 cycles. He tilted his head slightly to the left, an inch, and to the right, an inch, in the way an old operator will who is listening for a return acknowledgement he does not truly expect. Then he cut the carrier, unplugged the key from its lead at the back of the transmitter, wrapped the lead once around the base of the key, with the small, careful movement of a right-handed man, packing an object he has used for a long time, and set the whole assembly into a battered wooden box under the desk. Only then did he stand. He walked out of the frame toward the kitchen. Halevi wrote a second entry on the card. It read, "Carrier off 0, 3:28 and 12 seconds. Key packed." She telephoned Namias from a public telephone at the corner of the Lightwell Street at 3:34. She used 7 words. She said in German that the room had gone quiet and that the key was in a box. The disagreement in Tel Aviv, which had been latent for 3 days, came to the surface that Thursday, the 24th of February, in a small conference room at Herzliya, between 3 people who did not disagree in the personal sense and had disagreed for institutional reasons a dozen times before. The disagreement was between the deputy chief of Caesarea, who wanted a close target execution inside the room on Emanuel Benaki, the officer commanding Research Division, Nama El-Grabli, who wanted a capture and a lift and a slow, uncontroversial exfiltration through Larnaca and Ben Gurion, and a legal advisor from the Prime Minister's office, whose brief was to keep the fingerprints of the operation off Greek soil for the sake of the Papandreou government, which had granted the PLO diplomatic recognition and which would react in the Greek press to any Israeli action inside Athens exactly as a government of its politics would. The legal advisor's argument was that a lift was the smaller risk. A dead man on a 4th floor in Exarchia was a Greek murder investigation and a diplomatic protest. A lift carried out by 3 tourists into a car and to Piraeus, and onto the 11-hour Adriatica ferry to Limassol, and by the Larnaca Ben Gurion, Cyprus Airways short hop, was an absence that no Greek investigator would connect to a foreign service inside a working week. The counter-argument from Caesarea was that the target was a network commander who had run for 9 years off the quay and was therefore, by definition, difficult to keep in a room. It was that a lift was 3 men and 1 woman, and an uncooperative subject and a customs post at the port, and a set of Greek policemen at the ferry ramp, and a lot of ways to lose him. It was that the operation had spent 9 years and 1 recall of a retired sergeant major to identify the man, that it had spent 4 weeks in Athens to fix him inside 200 meters of himself, and that the moment he sent again, the moment his controllers heard him send again, they would move him inside a day. It was that a capture and lift was clean if it worked and catastrophic if it did not, and that a close target execution on the 25th of February was the cleaner outcome inside the operational window they actually had. El-Grabli reconciled the disagreement by a route neither the Caesarea deputy nor the legal advisor expected. She proposed a 3rd option. She proposed that the team enter the room, that Al-Fassi neutralize the operator not by weapon, but by a pharmacological compound already in the Caesarea equipment inventory for exactly this purpose, that the operator go from the room down the Lightwell stairs to Kimhi's Peugeot on a stretcher in the guise of a heart attack patient being taken to the private clinic on Marasley Street, and that from the private clinic the operator go by ambulance in the small hours to the Piraeus ferry, and by Adriatica sailing to Limassol as a dependent patient in the custody of a nurse. The nurse would be Halevi. The final leg to Ben Gurion would be the Larnaca short hop, under a stretcher case airline notification that Venturi had already arranged, in the Katrin Reuter name that a working freelance journalist could carry to the Athens hospital press office without raising a query. At 22, 10 hours local time on the 24th of February, the compromise was approved. At 03:27 the following morning, the operator on the 4th floor sent his last message. The 2 moments the deputy chief of Caesarea had feared did not happen. The operator did not move the aerial. His controllers did not pull him. The compound was in Al-Fassi's medical bag when she came up the stairs behind Siegel at 03:31, and by 03:34, the operator was on the tiled floor of the 4th floor room in the small kitchen, unconscious, breathing regularly, with his right hand still curled in the shape of the bug key he had been sending on 8 minutes earlier. The team did with him what the compromise had proposed. He came down the Lightwell stairs on a folding stretcher between Siegel and Kimhi at 03:52. He was in the back of the Peugeot estate with Al-Fassi, holding his wrist and reading his pulse aloud in German by 03:58. He was inside the private clinic on Marasley Street, whose duty nurse was Halevi at 04:11 local Athens time. He was on the deck of the Adriatica, Sol Phryne, sailing out of Piraeus at 18:30 hours the same day, in the aftermost first-class cabin at ferry crossing speed, with Halevi in the adjoining cabin in the white uniform of a private clinic nurse. He was at Larnaca International at 11:42 the following morning, on a Cyprus Airways short hop to Ben Gurion that took 42 minutes. He was on Israeli soil at 13:29 on the 26th of February, 1983. He was in a Mossad debriefing room in a suburb of Tel Aviv by that evening. The debriefing officers who took him in that evening did not know his name and were not told it. They were told he was a returned network commander of a Middle Eastern militant movement, whose identity was compartmented at the level of research division. They were told his cover identity for the purpose of the debriefing was to be a Lebanese schoolteacher from Sidon, called Mahmoud Awad. They were told his real vocation was to be discussed only in a room with a member of the desk that had brought him in, and only across the following month. They were shown a small green tally card with the number 14 on it, and it was returned to Sagi within the hour. He did not speak in the debriefing rooms for 3 weeks. He asked once, on the morning of the 12th day, for a Vibroplex bug key of the model he had used on Emmanuel Benaki. The request was refused. The transmission he had made at 03:27 and 41 seconds local on the 25th of February was, at the time of his capture, unread. The tape reels the team had recovered from the 4th floor room, and the Uher 400, whose spool was still turning when Alfasi entered the kitchen, were carried out with him inside a folded picnic blanket in the boot of the Peugeot. When they were played back at Glilot on the 27th of February, and when the 8 cipher groups had been broken against the pad, the Rome station of the Athens support cell had left in a dead drop on Vasilissis Sophias 3 days before. The message resolved into a single sentence in colloquial Palestinian dialect. It read, in translation, "Am closing the channel. Do not send again. Confirm the boy." The word, "the boy," was subject to interpretation. The research division's best reading was that Rashwan had been operating as the technical guarantor of the security of a Fatah communications channel between Athens and the successor cells inside Beirut, through the courier network that had collapsed after the previous August's evacuation, and that the sending of the burst on the 5th of February had been the emergency signal for the arrival, without independent papers, of a young courier in Athens, whose identity Rashwan needed his opposite number in Beirut to confirm before he handed the courier onward. The word "closing" implied he had realized, in the 11 days between the 2 bursts, that the channel had been detected. He had realized too late. What Rashwan had realized, when Sagi's colleagues put the debriefing pieces together across the following 6 weeks, was the small operational error he had made on the 5th of February that a man of his experience would in his working years never have made. He had opened the burst on the 5th without first spending 2 minutes listening on the frequency, which was standard practice for any HF operator entering a band that was not his usual frequency. If he had listened, he would have heard the faint carrier of the wideband receiver at Meron and might have thought better of transmitting. He had listened for a total of 9 seconds. The 9 seconds were the fossil his 9 years off the key had left in his tradecraft. A man who has not sent for a decade does not remember every discipline of the working year that produced him. On the 17th of March, 1983, 3 weeks and 1 day after the lift, Ben Arroyo was invited back to Glilot Junction for what the letter to Kibbutz Sasa called an outbriefing of the technical consultation. He drove down in the Peugeot 204 on the Wednesday afternoon and arrived at the North Gate at 0800 on the Thursday. He was escorted, this time by Sagi herself, back to the low gray building with no windows on its east face, and to the room with the Rakal RA-17 and the Nagra 4S. The tapes from the room on Emmanuel Benaki were on the table. Sagi asked him, before she played them, whether he would like to spend an hour beforehand with the archive drawer, which was open on a trolley beside the receiver. He said he would. She left him alone in the room with the drawer and the tapes. The drawer held 313 labeled reels. The 313th was new, the label made out in Sagi's handwriting in blue biro, instead of Ben Arroyo's own black ink of 1972. It carried the date of the 5th of February, 1983. On the outside of the box, the label read, Beirut 14, 313, then a single word in Hebrew that translated as found. He did not play the 5th of February reel. He knew what was on it. He worked backwards through the drawer to the last reel of 1972, took it out of the box, put it on the machine, and listened for 20 minutes to a session he had not heard in 11 years. Ordinary traffic. A weather note in the second block. The signature at the end. When he took the reel off the machine, he sat for a further 10 minutes with the headphones in his lap. The archive drawer, when he was ready, held its files in the ordinary research division sequence, alphabetical by target, chronological within the target's file. 2 folders back from Beirut 14, on the tab reading Beirut 9, lay the operations file that Research Division had opened in October 1972 on the sender who would later be named as Ali Hassan Salameh. In the top right corner of the front card of that file, in the same blue biro Sagi had used on the reel, someone had written on the 10th of February 1979 the word "closed." He put the drawer back on the trolley, closed it, and rang the bell for Sagi. They played the last 3 transmissions of the room on Emanuel Benaki, in order at his request. He did not comment on any of them. At the end, he said, in the flat voice, that he was satisfied. He was asked whether he wished for the recall of his reservist commitment to be extended by a further year. He said without pause that he did not. He left the room at 4 in the afternoon. He was on the road to the Galilee before dark. He reached Kibbutz Sasa at 9:43 that night, and the following Wednesday he was back at the youth club Morse class on the Straight Key. He did not tell the youth club what he had been doing in Tel Aviv. They did not ask. The youth club class that Wednesday held 11 students aged between 12 and 16. Ben Arroyo took them, as he had for the previous 7 years, through the standard evening exercise of 10 one-minute plain language passages sent from the instructor's key to the students' notebooks. He sent the passages that night on his own straight key from a 1952 Hammerland receiver in the corner of the clubroom. The students copied them down. When the class had ended and the students had gone home, Ben Arroyo sat for a further hour in front of the receiver with the headphones on. He tuned across the Levantine band. He listened for 12 minutes on the frequency at 8,145 kilohertz. There was nothing on it. He tuned away, unplugged the receiver, and locked the clubroom behind him. He did that on the Wednesday of every week for the remaining 17 years of his working life. He did not, in that time, hear the fist he had recognized in February 1983 on any frequency again. The file that closed the Beirut 14 record inside Research Division did not record most of what had happened. It did not record the compromise reached at Herzliya on the 24th of February between the Caesarea deputy and the legal advisor and El Grabli. It did not record the pharmacological compound. It did not record the private clinic on Morasley Street or the name of the duty nurse who had held the door open for the Peugeot estate as it reversed into the ramp. It did not record the Adriatica sailing or the Cyprus Airways short hop. It recorded the operation's name, cadence, and its opening date, the 9th of February 1983, and its closing date, the 26th of February 1983, and its outcome, which it summarized in a single line in the operational outcomes column. Beirut 14, recovered alive, committed to debriefing under Caesarea custody, transferred to institutional custody, 9 April 1983. That was all. The debriefings ran across the spring and summer of 1983, and the material Rashwan gave up over their course made a difference at the operational level for the 2 years that followed. The specific details of what he gave up remain classified and lie outside the story. What his debriefing did not reveal, the surrounding files at Glilot did. Between the summer of 1983 and the autumn of 1985, the Mossad closed 5 silent tray files that had been open for periods of between 4 and 11 years. 2 of the 5 were Beirut Vector and had been logged by Ben Arroyo himself in 1970 and 1972. Neither of the 2 had ever transmitted again, and neither ever would. In each case, the closure card carried the same 3-word Hebrew notation as the Beirut 14 card. Hand identified, retrospectively. The Rue Verdun street on which Ali Hassan Salameh had been killed in January 1979 and on which the Fatah leaders had been killed in the Spring of Youth raid of April 1973, was written into the file as an operational cross-reference at the 9th of February entry. Under it, in Sagi's handwriting, a further reference was added on the 28th of February to the PLO headquarters at Hammam Chat on the coast of Tunisia, 20 kilometers south of the capital, from which the network commander's original controllers now issued their orders. 2 years and 7 months later, at 10:05 in the morning of the 1st of October 1985, that headquarters would be destroyed by 10 Israeli F-15 aircraft in a strike that would cover 1,280 miles from Israeli airspace and would last 6 minutes. Beirut 14 would by then have been 8 months into a life inside institutional custody in a place he never named, on a monthly allowance he never spent, sending Morse to no one on a Vibroplex bug key that had been quietly returned to him on the 22nd of April. The returning of the key was Sagi's idea. She had put it to El Grabli in a memorandum on the 6th of April that El Grabli signed on the 7th without correction. The memorandum ran to 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph noted that the debriefing subject had asked for a bug key on the 12th day of his intake and had been refused. The second paragraph noted that the refusal had contributed to his silence in the debriefing room on the interpretation of the officer who had run the intake and had not achieved any operational purpose. The third paragraph recommended that a key be issued to the subject in his living quarters on a strictly controlled, non-radiating basis, that a length of oscilloscope-terminated cable be attached to the key in place of a transmitter lid, and that the subject be permitted to send Morse into the terminated cable at any time of day or night. The subject, the memorandum said, would send to nobody, would generate no signal detectable outside his room, and would be spared the specific institutional cruelty of a man who has been taken away from the one activity his hand had learned to do. Sagi signed the memorandum LS. She had not signed a document with those initials since the January card. El Grabli countersigned it and passed it upstairs. The key was in Rashwan's living quarters by the evening of the 22nd. He sent on it into the terminated cable at unpredictable hours across the remaining years of his custody. What he sent was never recorded and was never asked for. The technicians who set the equipment up were told not to log the traffic. What they did notice, on the 2 occasions across the first 6 months that a technician was in the room while the subject was sending, was that the subject sent on the returned key with the same short space, minutely tightened rhythm between the 3rd and the 4th dot that Ben Arroyo had recognized, from 312 reels of quarter-inch tape on the 9th of February at 08:52 hours in a windowless room off Corridor B at Glilot Junction. The moral question at the center of Cadence is not whether the operation was justified in the terms in which those who conducted it believed it was justified. That question has an answer that is either yes or no, depending on which chair you sit in, and this channel has never tried to move a viewer from one chair to another. The question is a smaller one, and it is older than the 20th century. A trained radio operator's fist is an involuntary property of his body. It is not a habit he can drop the way he can drop a favored coffee shop or an unwise mistress. It is not a signature he can teach himself out of the way an old novelist can teach himself out of a favored adjective. It is the way his hand happens to move when it moves. It is closer to a fingerprint than to a walking pace, and it is closer to a walking pace than to a name. A man can change his name. He cannot easily change the way his hand holds the space between the 3rd dot and the 4th. Rashwan spent 9 years off the air because his service knew this, and because his service tried to hide him inside a silence that would take the fist off the record. The service that hunted him waited 9 years because it knew, correctly, that the day he touched a key would be the day the tape ran. The old argument in favor of the operation is that a network commander who has run traffic against a state that is legally at war with the movement he served is a legitimate target of the service of that state, and that the state's willingness to spend 9 years of patience and 1 weekend of tape recording to render him harmless without killing him is, on the moral spectrum available to secret services, a merciful outcome. The old argument against is that the property being exploited is one the target has not chosen, that the recognition of it inside a listener's memory, sustained across a decade of silence, is an intimacy the target has not consented to and cannot know he has given, and that a state that will take a man by a property of his own body has crossed a line the service that trained the listener may never quite have looked at. There is a further complication that the operation itself, once it had ended, made unavoidable. The listener who identified the hand had held the file for 4 years and had spent 7.5 years of his retirement without hearing the hand again. On the morning of the 9th of February, he identified the hand from 2 minutes and 47 seconds of tape in a windowless room in a Tel Aviv suburb. The state that hunted the operator did not have to teach the listener to remember. The listener had never stopped remembering. What the state had done was to keep the file open for 9 years in a drawer next to the Salama file, and to know correctly that the listener would come when he was called. The operation, by that reading, was less an act of the state than an act of an old man who had spent 7.5 years waiting for a burst he had promised a corporal in the officers' mess would eventually come. Where do you sit? Was Rashwan taken by his own hand, or by the state that knew his hand better than he did? And does it matter which, when the outcome is the same? Tell us in the comments. Share this with the friend who will disagree with you most sharply, and subscribe for the next Operation Insights with Daniel. Thank you for watching.